of sterling. Talks a little bit about the German language possibly being the most spoken language on the battlefield, and introduces us to Marshal Ney, the red-haired hero of the Russian retreat who led the cavalry charge at Waterloo, and the local legend that he was born in Fintry. Next, please, Ross. This is the famous picture of the Scottish hero Ewart capturing the Eagle of the 45th. Next. And these are stills from the movie Waterloo Revisited and Fintry. Next. So there's two slides of the sequence of events. And the fact that it was muddy is an important thing to bear in mind. It slowed everything up at the beginning. It'd been rain overnight, and the armies had sat out all night in the pouring rain. Jerome, Napoleon's brother, led a misguided attack on the big farm estate at Hougoumont at 11 o'clock. It lasted all day. And then you can see the French artillery opens fire, the infantry columns advance, the heavy cavalry counterattack at 2:15. There's a hard pounding all day. And then the French cavalry attack at about 4 o'clock. Next, please. And the Prussians start arriving with Bülow at 5 o'clock in the evening. The French break through in the middle. The French drive out the Prussians at Plancenoit. More Prussians coming around Papelotte. And then the Imperial Guard attacks the Wellington's line at 7:30 in the evening. And there's the famous, the Guard retreats, everyone from themselves. Thanks. It's the small battlefield, the deployment in the mud. Next. That's the size of it, that's the deployment. You can see Hougoumont sits out to the front of the Allied line shown in red. Next. And that's a modern map marked up by my son Patrick. And you can see Hougoumont on the left, Papelotte on the right, de Belle Alliance. Which was the Prussian proposal for the name of the battle. Wellington thought Waterloo sounded more British, and so you see the size of it. And again, please look at the next one. Get the shape of that against the deployment, and then the next one to see it on sterling, I think. So it goes from the middle of Spring Kerse over to Kings Park. And the station past the hospital and stuff. I mean, it's a tiny area for such a decisive battle. If anybody would like one of these centred on their house, then you could let me know. Next, please. And again. And again. So what's happening here is that Wellington had actually spotted this piece of terrain in advance, and he had deployed on the reverse slopes next. That means that most of his troops are not visible to the French. So if you look at the geography there, most of them are hidden behind that front line, whereas most of the French are visible. Next. The artillery planning is something that gives an insight into the thinking. Wellington has spread his artillery batteries, 6 or 8 guns each, across the whole of the front, whereas Napoleon concentrated all of his into one. There's the famous review of the troops, and there's a couple of photographs just to go through quickly. This is from the reenactment at the Battle of Waterloo in 2015. Next. That's the same. Next. So this was an attack that shouldn't really have taken up so much French effort. It was very lightly defended, and Jerome set out to capture it because it looked easy and it would give him a little victory of his own. It lasted all day and it sucked in 14,000 French soldiers, and it didn't succeed. Next. That's a picture of the time. And next. Tony Pollard's been doing a lot of work here. And one of the things that people say is it was too lightly defended. And Wellington said, "Ah, you don't know MacDonald." Next, please. This is MacDonald of Glengarry. Next. Nice picture of Glengarry, I think. Next again. He became a colonel in the Coldstream Guards by 1811 and was a general 1854. Next. He features in the famous picture of the closing of the gate. That's him there at the front. So, and next again. Uxbridge said, what do we need to do? And he said, keep Hougoumont. So light companies are sent in, they prepared it, they get fire steps. Probably 4,000 soldiers over the course of the day, and there were 7 major French assaults on it during the day. 1,500 Allied casualties, and the thing that Tony Pollard's work has shown is that there were surgeons working within Hougoumont, treating wounded. Lots of French casualties, unknowable, but the 1st Light Infantry Regiment had 602 on the 24th, whereas before that, the morning of the battle, he had 1,850. Next. Next again. A couple of pictures, I think. Next. You'll see the square box in the middle. That's showing where the French concentrated the artillery against the Allied lines. Whereas, as I said before, Wellington had spread his batteries across the Lewis front. Next again. That's from the Waterloo reenactment. Next. Artillery tactics were to fire the ball with very little elevation, so it's fired almost flat. And the idea was that it would graze on the ground at 400 yards, 600 yards, 750 yards, meters if you like. But the muddy fields stops this grazing. The other type of round that the French used was a shell, which would be a metal ball with an explosive inside it that would hit the ground and then blow up, and the fragments would fire about. But if it drops into mud, it has less of an effect. So the grazing effect doesn't work and the shells don't work in the mud. Next, please. The main French infantry unit starts to move forward, 20,000 soldiers, and there were 6,000 British, Dutch and Hanoverians defending. The Hanoverians, the King's German Legion, plus Hanoverian units, and because the King was King of Hanover as well as Great Britain and Ireland, and they spoke German, so bear that in mind. It had been thought, next please, that this attack was made on a 2-company frontage per battalion in company columns or division columns. It now seems that what happened was that the battalion were deployed in line, the three ranks deep, and then in successive battalions, one after the other. So they moved in 4 units like that, but in battalion lines rather than narrow companies. So some of the speculation about fire effect is probably wrong. Next, please. That's a picture of a famous reenactor called Dick Dellingpole, on the right. Next, please. Picture from the film. It's not a bad representation. Now we know it's showing the French moving up towards Highlander soldiers deployed on the front with artillery behind. Next. These are all Russians. This film was made in the Soviet Union. So that's more or less what it looked like as they moved round. The cavalry moving round to the side, cuirassier, armoured cavalry. And the infantry columns there shown by arrows. Next. And that's from the film again. Next. The producers managed to convince the local Russian government to model a whole new piece of countryside to reflect the Waterloo battlefield. And they dug it all out and recreated it. No CGI in those days. So that's kind of what it looked like as they passed up to attack the Allied line on the high ground. Next. There they come. Next again. So all we've seen are red coats, you see. And that's Wellington and Picton from the film. Next. And as the French move up, the Dutch-Belgian brigade break and run away, and then Picton orders his soldiers to counterattack, but they're forced back. Picton is killed. There's a ridiculous picture, shot that you'll see in a minute from the film, where his hat explodes. And a lot of French soldiers got to the crest of the hill. Next. That's the famous Picton shot through the head, except not really. Next. And there they come. That's a French drawing that's close to the period that shows the sorts of poses that would be used. You can see the soldiers in the main columns of their muskets held to their shoulder vertically. The light infantry at the front of their muskets held ready to fire, and the officer is being confident with his sword to the side. Next. The heavy cavalry counterattack that drives them back, the Household Brigade and the Union Brigade. Next, please. Famous Butler pictures showing the Gordon Highlanders and the Scots Greys. Next. I love the guy jumping over the horse. There's 2 eagles captured. It wasn't just the 45th. The 105th was captured as well. There's a lot of overlap between European dictators in Rome. Napoleon chose the eagles. Hitler chose eagles, things like that. Next, please. These 2 eagles, that's the Ensign Ewart capturing the 45th. Next. People in Edinburgh Castle are very proud of that. But the Royal Dragoons, who captured the Eagle, the 105th, there was a bloke from Dumfries. So it's actually 2 Scotsmen captured the 2 eagles on the day. Next. That's the famous Butler picture. She actually, I think, was it her husband? Some close relative anyway. She got his cavalry regiment to charge her so she could get the images for this in days before photography. Next, please. Next again. Next, that's from the film, again, Soviet soldiers. These are reenactors at the Waterloo 2015. Next. This is from the big diorama, panorama thing in Waterloo that shows the French cavalry attack. you can see on the right-hand side, there's a red-haired officer, that's Ney, and that's from the movie again. There were French, no, that's fine, leave it at that, please. The Soviets at the time appeared to have mounted units, and so they're able to deploy cavalry units from the Russian army, including they had a unit that rode white horses, so they dressed them up as Scots Greys. Next, please. And that's the way that the cavalry went. Now, the problem here is that there'd been a miscommunication, and the front elements had started to move forward because Wellington had moved some of his units back because of the artillery fire, and people in French cavalry thought that they were retreating and started to charge forward. Ney found himself at the front, and despite trying to slow them down, eventually gave up and just ordered everyone forward. But cavalry unsupported at this period is not a good idea. No infantry, no artillery, just men on horses charging up a hill. Next, please. And there they go again from the Waterloo panorama, which is a 3D thing. The dead horse at the front, the model up there, that's on our side of the screen. The painting is on the other side. Next again. Reenactors in square. What happens with, if infantry have time, they can form up into this unit where in 2-3 ranks, possibly even 4 ranks, the front rank kneeling with their muskets and bayonets fixed at an angle against their heel, and the next rank with their muskets fixed over the shoulders of the front and the ranks behind firing. So that's something that a horse is not going to like charging into. Next, please. Oh, it's a Butler picture of a Highland regiment doing exactly that, and the horse is not wanting to get close. Next again. The accounts of squares that break, this from the film, are to do with horses falling against a corner or something like that, and then other people getting in behind that. But other than that, squares are not vulnerable to horses. Next again. Back to the second part. You remember from the introduction, the Prussians arriving about 5 o'clock, the French getting into Lysont at 6:30, more Prussians, and then the Imperial Guard attack. So that's what we're doing next. Quickly, next, please. So Prussians swinging around. At this stage, German is probably the most spoken language on the battlefield. Next again. Next, please. This is looking at it in more detail. Just go through these pictures quickly, please, the next 3 or 4. Reenactors, that's the church itself. The priest said Mass on the Sunday, despite the battle going all around them. These are different illustrations of what's going on in the villages. The Prussians come in. Prussian reenactors. A famous painting of the Prussians breaking through. And that's the French Guard coming back in. Then the infantry from Derlon move up and actually break in. This is from an Airfix kit that some people might remember from the 1970s. Despite this bravery, the French get in. Next again. There again. Next. And again. The Inniskillens had arrived from Bermuda just in time to get to Waterloo. As the French captured Lysont, they bring up their artillery, and Inniskillens were in a square because of the cavalry threat. And I said earlier that a square against cavalry is not vulnerable at all, but it's a bit scissors, stone, paper. Artillery against squares will win. Squares against cavalry will win. So if the French bring up artillery, then it's going to be not a good thing. So they lost 80% of their strength, dead and wounded, and they were found lying in the square. Wellington claimed that they had saved the centre of the line. Thank you. Next. That's a picture of the start of that engagement. Next. Next. This is coming in from the east. Next again. And again. The last throw, next please, Napoleon decides that he's got to break through to Brussels. His Imperial Guard has never been beaten, so off they go. Again, musket straight up, the bearskin hats. This is the famous French song. I'll just play a little bit of it. If you've got any French at all, you know that it's I Like the Onions. So it's one of the strangest marching songs you can imagine. They, you can look to the third verse. The Austrians don't get onions. Oh no, the Austrians, they're all dogs. They're not getting our onions. Next, please. So imagine these heroes of France, these old soldiers marching along singing about fried onions. Next again. And at this stage, it's looking a little bit grim for the French. Prussians are pushing in from the east, and the last thing they're doing is firing the Imperial Guard up there on the left against the Allied line. Next, please. Next again. Famously, Wellington had the British soldiers lying down as the French guards moved up, and various quotes, he might have said, "Up guards and at 'em." But he certainly directly ordered, he moved about him personally to each crisis point on the battlefield. He got them to up and to counter-attack as the French columns were coming up the hill. Next, please. The Prussians break in. Next again. So the Imperial Guard are driven back. The Prussians are succeeding here. Next. That famous moment when the last remnants of the French Guard are standing at Waterloo in a square, and they're given the opportunity to surrender, and their commander shouts, "Merde!" They move back and the artillery fire on them. Next, please. And they meet at, you see on the sign, the bell, the Great Alliance or the Good Alliance. Next, please. German soldiers all sang Nun danket. Now thank we all our God, to mark the victory. I don't think the British soldiers or the Hanoverians or anybody else did that, but it's recorded that the Prussian soldiers thanked God for the victory. Next. And that's the end of the battle. Next. And finally, this is a weird one. A few years ago at the Smith, with TV, press and everything, there was a story that Marshal Neil, red-haired general that we saw, hadn't been born in Saint-Louis or died in Paris. That's the official record. Next. That's the painting, The Death of Ney. The soldiers are marching off the firing squad. He was dressed as a civilian, shot down. Next. The story was that he survived the execution, and his real name was Peter Stuart McNay, and he was smuggled to America, where he arrived and became a school teacher. And in 1846, 30 years after the battle, he said, "I am Ney of France." Next. And he's got a mausoleum. Next. The sign on it reads, "In memory of Peter Stuart Ney, a native of France and a soldier of the French Revolution, who departed this life." 1846. Next. It was claimed he was born in Fintry. David McNee had a younger brother who was called Peter Stuart McNee, and he may have left Scotland to support the revolution. Next. So Peter Stuart McNee became Michel Ney, and then Peter Stuart Ney, and he's buried in North Carolina. Next. And there's the Fintry Inn in happier times. Next. Now, that's the big brother. I think this story is a load of tosh. But if you look at the next picture, there's a slight resemblance. So you could convince yourself that these were brothers. Next. The best part of the story is that Patrick McNee from the Avengers is the great-great-grandson of the white-haired gent. Next. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and that was excellent. Really enjoyed that. I'll ask everybody to unmute yourself, and we want to give a round of applause to Jim. Thank you. Excellent. So what we'll do is we'll go around and do questions if there are any questions as normal. So I don't know, I was talking to someone earlier on, and it was an interesting question, but I would like to ask yourself this, Jim. You had a choice to go back to any war and fight in any war on any side. What war would you go back and partake in?
Oh, crikey. I would choose to be an RAF ground crew man in the Second World War, because that's pretty safe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or a line of communication driver in the Service Corps in the Second World War, because that's pretty safe. Everything else.
My granddad done on the National Service, RAF and
yes.
the maintenance work.
Yeah. Pay Corps. Pay Corps is not a bad one either. I think the Korean War, being in the Korean War in the Pay Corps sounds pretty good. My father-in-law did that, and he was shot in the heel by an American aircraft. That's probably the riskiest thing that would happen to a Pay Corps person.
So to go back to the top though, about this guy from Fintry, McNee, what what kind of importance did he have? An important role? Did he just decide to get up and support the revolution and become a foot soldier? What kind of impact did he have?
I don't know. This is a presentation that a group of people made at the time a few years ago in the Smith, and it's so unlikely a story that this guy became a Marshal of France. Although red-haired, and there's enough of the story to make it a little bit like Elvis is still alive, you know, it's sort of all a little bit weird. But I just I included it in the talk because the whole McNay, Ney, and then Patrick McNee, and the fact that when you look at the pictures side by side, there's ever so slightly a resemblance. You think, could there be something in this? Yeah, probably not. Very unlikely. I can't imagine a Scotsman having a believable French accent, but it wouldn't have been recorded at the time as been a little bit odd.
We've got Dick King here asking a question. What would have been the broad consequences had Napoleon, apologies, had not been defeated? So what would have been the what if scenario?
I think that the other powers the other powers were massing on the border. So the Austrians, who are dogs and don't deserve their onions, were on their way. The Russians were on their way, and the whole issue that France has got a problem that the Royal Navy is so powerful that they're limited in what they do. They're a land power. British Army is small, always had been, but the Continental armies are up against him, and he's not going to be able to survive very long, I don't think. And the death rate under the Bourbons is nothing like the death rate under the Republic. So it's probably better for the people of France that that he didn't succeed in the end.
I remember watching a documentary, and it said, apart from Jesus Christ, Napoleon is the most talked about man in literature. Came throughout all the different stands and things like that, and there must be something there that's so it makes it so popular almost, or so mainstream. Or well,
when I was younger, I had a bust of Napoleon that I had on the mantelpiece. But as I've learned more, I've taken the bust down and put it in a cupboard. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah, it's quite interesting how the sort of the perspective of history, things like imperial legacies and things are all now being reevaluated in this new light. Certainly, thinking. I remember hearing somebody talking this about Caesar, for example. Is depending on what society looks back on Caesar, they either see him as a conqueror or a liberator, and it's quite telling that in a more ethical, PC, politically correct society that we look back on these things a bit more judgmentally.
Yeah, it's where do you draw the line? That the whole Roman society was based on expansion, invasion, mass murder, slavery. And that's fine then. We'll base our buildings on those.
Absolutely. Is there any other questions? Sorry, I don't think I actually asked that question. I started just going away to you there, Jim. Is there any other questions around the room? I don't think so, no.
One of the things that I found interesting myself was Tony Pollard's work on Hougoumont, where he has set up a charity to take veterans with PTSD or physical injury and get them to do archaeological work at Hougoumont. Mm-hmm. And so they're digging in a place where a couple of 100 years ago, soldiers were under a lot of stress, and they're finding artifacts. And one of the things they started to do, they started painting toy soldiers, model soldiers. and they found that very therapeutic. And that's where his idea for the biggest toy soldier war game in Glasgow a couple of years ago came from.
Excellent. Well, was this happened in Glasgow? So that sounds quite interesting.
It's in Glasgow, in the Butte Hall. They took over the Butte Hall and they did a big war game of the Battle of Waterloo with 20, 30,000 toy soldiers, something like that anyway. But he's looked at the processes of how do you do medicine when you're in that situation, and that's where the idea of the number of casualties and the surgeons active within the farmyard, if you've ever been there, the walled compound, and that's quite an interesting insight. And the other one, although I knew it, I hadn't thought about it, that this idea of grazing, the artillery being fired horizontally and then bouncing and then up again and bouncing and up again. And if it's muddy, that doesn't work. So the French artillery couldn't do its job as a force to drive that hole in the middle.
You've got so much more chance of hitting somebody if you're firing along the plane. If you've got the trajectory going, you're only got that chance of hitting them there. Where going flat, it's just a no-brainer. Another thing I felt quite interesting is when you're talking squares formations, very much reminiscent of the what do you call it, the Chilterns. Yes. Is that something that came from the Scottish regiments and things like that?
There's been spear formations ever since there were pointy sticks, I think. Think about Alexander's very long spears in his infantry formations. But basically, standing close to somebody who's also got a pointy stick is better than having a pointy stick on your own. And so I think ever since people have been fighting with spears, then that's happened. The Chiltern, I think, is one of the points that Murray's made in the past, that one of the points that Bruce developed was that he trained the Chiltern soldiers to walk, whereas before they just stood still. And Napoleonic War, a square could walk. They could move along. They didn't have to stand still. They could actually get up and move. And if the cavalry came closer, they could stop and kneel down and so on.
Was there a reason to wear over a circle?
That's a good point. I think because they're trained to fight in lines, it probably felt better for them to be in a line rather than to go into a circle. But a circle is obviously going to be stronger because it doesn't have any weak points like the corner.
Yeah, well, remember you saying that was often one of the weak points. If it did make a break, it was at the corner. So was this something that the Argylls were involved in as well?
Not to this. No, the one of the battalions was one of the original regiments was there, but in the rear, one of the issues for Wellington for Wellington particularly was ensuring the link to the coast, and so the whole line of communication, protecting that. And so I can't remember which one of the original regiments was there, but one was in that behind the main front line. But lots of Scottish people. And the other thing is there's lots of Scottish and Irish people in English named regiments. A regiment might be numbered on or named as the West Yorkshire whatnots, but a third of them would be Irish and a third of them would be Scottish.
Was there a reason for that? Was that just they had so much troop loss that they just wanted both of their own regiments?
I think a lot of it was poverty related. And it also got you out of your own little community. It's kind of hard to say what motivated people, but it could also be that Irish and Scottish people wanted to fight more than some others in these islands.
Right, well, I think...
pressed the wrong button there.
Well, I think if there's not any other questions, we'll leave it there for today. So I just want to again take the time, Jim, to say thank you very much for another great talk. If anybody does want to unmute themselves and give Jim a last round of applause for his time today. Thank you very much. Thank you. So thank you again, everybody, for attending. We'll be back next week. Sorry, it's off the top of my head what next week's lecture is, but we'll be here same time again next week.
It's not me. I'm in a fortnight.
Okay.
Right, thank you all. Bye.
Bye.
Mm-hmm.